When I first signed up to teach this class, I was really excited about the timing. In an alternative reality, the Democratic National Convention was held a week ago or so, and the elections would be in full swing. We could talk about the changes and how presidents campaigned from earlier generations to today, reflecting on the speeches, rallies, and ads we were seeing in real time. And honestly, though, right now you could sort of forget that there is a presidential election going on right now. And that might be because I don't use Facebook or watch very much live TV, so maybe I just don't engage with any of the ads or dialogue going on around the campaign. But it's very muted, and that's because there's so much else going on, obviously. Timing aside, though, I still think we have a really interesting week of readings, which will help you all. Hopefully, you can reflect back in 4 years when we have a normal presidential election and think about all the concepts that we talk about. Running for president is almost as big of a deal as being president. The campaign sort of takes on a life of its own. And I don't know about you, but I sort of have an equal number of memories about presidential campaigns and the goofs and blunders and speeches that some gave as I do about what actually occurred during the presidency. And so the presidential campaign is a really big deal. And so what we want to explore this week is, has it always been that way? How has it changed? Where has sort of power shifted within sort of the campaign apparatus? And, where are we now? And I think it's sort of a useful place to end the class in, this being our last week, because it pulls in a lot of strands from earlier weeks and content. How have our expectations of the president changed, and how has that influenced campaigns? How has the balance of the office shifted between foreign and domestic concerns, and how does that change the way that the president becomes elected? How has the media changed, and how does that change the way that the president engages with the American public? All of these things that we've talked about in previous weeks are central to the campaign experience. The campaign is almost the distillation of the presidency into sort of its most essential functions, or at least the appearance of its most essential functions. And then obviously we have last week's topic where we talk about actually running the presidency. But right now we're just going to focus on becoming president. And so I think our readings do a really good job of pulling out these different threads and highlighting the place of campaigns in the presidency. One thing that I assigned this week is the podcast, Wicked Games. With that, you can choose whatever week you want to listen to. And I don't know exactly how you should pick a week on that. You could pick the campaign that's most interesting to you, or the one you think is the most important or the most exciting. To be honest, I don't actually think it's the best podcast I've ever listened to. I'm certain that it's not the best podcast I've ever listened to. They do some reenactment in it for just a sort of a few brief spurts. I don't know. It's not the greatest podcast, but it is the best podcast about American campaigns that we have. And it's walking through every presidential campaign in history. It's a weekly episode. It started last year, and it's going to end right before the election this year. And so it's a really good place to go if you want this broad history just of presidential campaigns. And think about, as you're listening to whichever episode you picked, what's changed from the period that you listened to today, or how is the convention different? Is the media different? Are the parties different? Are the president's backgrounds different? A lot has changed, a lot has stayed the same, of course. And just think about these sort of ways that the story you're hearing from 1940 or 1860 or 1830, how much of it would be similar today? How much of it sounds completely odd and strange from what you know of politics today, and how much of it do you think would actually just fit in the modern context? One thing that has always been true about presidential elections in particular is that there's always been this sort of apocalyptic thinking. There were people saying that if Thomas Jefferson beat John Adams, it would be the death of the republic, and vice versa. It's always been a wicked game, as the podcast implies. And so I wanted to give people this sort of quick snapshot of how things were in a different era, sort of a deep read on one presidential campaign. The presidential candidates now and then article provides more of a broad context to complement Wicked Games. And it's an overview of how the candidates have changed over time. And so I like that contrast, a deep dive on one particular election, and then also getting this broad history of all of the campaigns up through fairly recently. The article on how to steal an election is really interesting. I think it was published in the New Yorker. And it provides a really broad history of conventions. And again, sadly, there won't be a normal convention this year. And they've become much more perfunctory over time. We know who the nominee is going to be weeks before they're officially nominated by the parties. Joe Biden is not officially the Democratic nominee yet. That will occur at the convention. And conventions used to be incredibly intense and incredibly important, and you didn't know before the convention who was going to come out as the nominee. And I think that that's really important to understand in sort of the shift in presidential politics and campaigning. And what I want you to really think about there is who did those old conventions give power to in terms of choosing who the president was? And then and if that has changed, who has taken that power? Or has that power just sort of changed in its visibility? Is it the same people with the power, but they're using it differently? Because I think that conventions are a really interesting sort of microcosm of the change of politics in the United States over this sort of long trend of history. The last two articles provide this sort of a more specific context on some really popular concepts about the presidency and hopefully some depth. You may have heard of these words: the presidential mandate, the incumbency advantage. And if you haven't, get ready to learn a bit about them. But even if you have, you'll get a lot more background on what they mean. And those articles are really looking at, are they really that important? Are they real? Are they just imagined by the press or the citizens? What does that mean for our understanding of the presidency? And so I think that this week's readings give this really broad context of both how our campaigns run, who is campaigning, what do campaigns mean in sort of the American psyche, and some of these sort of specific ideas of what matters in the election. So I hope you enjoy all of the readings, and I'll see you all on the discussion boards.